Hi, and welcome to this AP Environmental Science video on ecological succession. I want to start with a case study. This is a case study on Mount St. Helens. In 1980, the eruption of Mount St. Helens offered ecologists a rare opportunity to study how communities recover from catastrophic disturbances. On May 18th, 1980, May 18th is actually my wedding anniversary, this volcano in the state of Washington erupted in a sudden and spectacular violence. The massive explosion obliterated an entire landscape of forest as a scalding mix of gas, steam, ash, and rock was hurled outward. A pyroclastic flow spread downhill, along with the largest landslide in recorded history. Rock and ash rained down as mudslides and lahars raced down the valley rivers, devastating everything in their path. Altogether, 4.1 cubic kilometers of material was ejected from the mountain, affecting an area twice the size of New York City. In the aftermath of the blast, ecologists moved in to take advantage of the natural experiment of a lifetime. For them, the eruption provided an extraordinary chance to study how primary succession, or the change in organisms over time, unfolds on a fresh volcanic surface. Which organisms would arrive first? What kinds of communities would emerge? How long would the process take? These researchers set up study plots to examine how populations, communities, and ecosystems would respond. Here you can see a picture of Mount St. Helens before and after the eruption, plus today. You can see how there was a lush environment before the eruption, a lunar landscape almost, an absolutely barren lunar landscape immediately afterward. And today, succession, or the introduction of new species, has brought diversity of species back. You can also see a couple of graphs below showing the return of these species. On the x-axis, we're graphing years since the eruption. And on the y-axis, we're graphing here percent plant cover and here species richness, or the number of species. What you can see is that some plots were deliberately reseeded with new plant life, and some plots were left wild. But in both cases, over time, plant cover began to retake the mountain, as you can see in the photo. Likewise, plots that were seeded and plots that were unseeded had slightly different growth rates, but in both cases, there was a dramatic increase in the number of species in the 30 years since the eruption. A couple of learning goals in this video. After watching this video, you should be able to describe how terrestrial ecosystems experience succession, describe whether succession occurs in aquatic ecosystems, identify how succession impacts species richness, biomass, and productivity, and explain the importance of keystone species and indicator species. There's a couple of terms we want to start with. First is ecological succession, which is the predictable replacement of one group of species by another group of species over time. Specifically, primary succession is ecological succession occurring on surfaces with bare rock and no soil, such as Mount St. Helens immediately after the eruption. And then pioneer species. In primary succession, these are species that can survive with little or no soil cover. So these will really be your first species to take root in primary succession. I want to do a quick comparison between primary succession and secondary succession. Primary succession is starting from bare rock. So this could be after a lava flow, after an eruption, or if there was some sort of massive erosion event that brought away all the soil. Really, your first species that come in are going to be lichens. This is a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and a bacteria, and those species can exist on rock with incredibly little soil cover, no soil cover. What those lichens will do is secrete some acids and other chemicals and seep into the rock and allow the rock to break up over time. And over a series of years, over perhaps many years or decades, that rock will break down into soil, which will allow grasses, small herbs, and shrubs to begin to grow. This pathway at the top here is what we call primary succession. This pathway at the bottom where you're starting with soil is called secondary succession. So if there were a disturbance event that removed all the trees and plant cover but left the soil intact, that would be a secondary succession sort of track that we're looking at. What I'd like to point out is the general progression here is going from very, very small organisms such as lichens, these single-celled symbiotes, to grasses and shrubs and short, fast-growing trees, to then trees that are shade intolerant. That's trees that require full sunlight. And finally, with the establishment of those trees, you can get some shade-tolerant trees that will grow even in the shade of larger trees. And that progression is pretty typical across a variety of ecosystems. Here's some images of secondary succession. And again, you can see that the plant life has been destroyed, but the soil has remained intact. During the second year, grasses begin to come in. In the 5th year, you get larger grasses, you get some shrubs, and then after about 20 years, you're beginning to get trees. These trees are spaced out. They would be shade intolerant or full sun trees, but after a little while, you would get some shaded trees that would come into the environment. So I want you to consider a couple of questions before you move on. Pause the video here and think about these. Consider, how might the dispersal ability contribute to succession? It's the dispersal of seeds and pollen from plants. And also describe why the term climax community may be an unrealistic description of succession. Climax community we can define as the finished product or the ultimate or the final species that exist in an environment. Why might that be unrealistic? Again, pause the video for a quick moment and consider those questions. When you're finished, you can press play again. Right here, we're looking at succession in aquatic communities, and this is going to proceed a little bit differently than it will in our terrestrial communities, just by the nature of what's growing in water. So you consider the graphs on the left here, where we have flooding from a sample set of data. And on the first graph, we're looking at days after flooding on the x-axis, and we're looking at stream cover on the y-axis. And monitoring the river over 2 months post-flood found initially colonization of algae with initial influx of these diatoms, followed by then cyanobacteria, which is a species of blue-green algae, followed a little bit later by some green algae, Cladifera. As the stream bottom became covered in algae, the percentage of bare sand rapidly declined. You can see bare sand, not a species, but just an observation of the geology there, declining right here. So again, you get this succession of species, first diatoms coming in, and then those diatoms initially being the sole organism there, being replaced by the blue-green algae and the green algae, which must be more competitive, more fit for the environment, and replacing those diatoms. And that's our succession in that aquatic environment. You can also see in this next graph here the number of invertebrates. So even though we see the species composition is changing, the raw number of invertebrates is going up quite a bit there. And that algae is going to provide a source of food for the invertebrates. So as we're growing more algae, we're clearly seeing an increase in invertebrates. It's also interesting to note that in aquatic communities, succession might take place in the form of geology, where you might have a pond that gets filled in over time from sediment until it eventually disappears, and that will also drive species composition. At this point, I'd like to look at a couple of graphs showing this pattern of succession. Across all 3 graphs, we're graphing years on the x-axis. And starting in graph A on the left here, we're looking at species richness of woody plants. And what you can see is that initially it starts quite low, where we have a secondary succession event perhaps, but over time those species begin to increase and then perhaps even decrease a little bit at the end if there's a drawback in the number of species during the succession. In a second graph, you notice species richness of birds. Likewise, you see a massive increase in the beginning in the initial 80 years of succession, but then perhaps a bit of a dieback as those birds overpopulate the area or crowd the area and the less fit species begin to die off. And finally, you see species richness of algae and invertebrates, and you see really that same pattern of the birds, that there's a rapid increase in invertebrate species and then perhaps a bit of a die-off with the less fit species. Here's some more graphs showing the effects of succession on both richness, biomass, and productivity. Again, graphing age on the x-axis. Species richness, you notice for grasslands increases, for shrubs increases, and for forests increase. That, again, is what we're seeing all along, that the species richness and diversity increases. In our second graph, you're looking at biomass, and I think it makes sense here that our grasslands have very little biomass. They're just quite short grasses, relatively little carbon sequestered there. The shrubs in the forest begin to increase dramatically the amount of biomass held in a community. And finally, the productivity. Interestingly, grasslands are quite productive and shrubs very, very productive. Relatively speaking, forests a little bit less productive relative to their biomass. A lot of the trunk of a tree is biomass, but not actually productive. So we see ecosystems at their most productive in this intermediary stage of their succession. I would ask you to pause the video again and consider this question. If we were to disturb a community, will it return to its original state, or will we just leave the area alone? Again, pause the video for a second as you think about that answer. I'd argue that the answer to this question is probably not if the disturbance has been substantial. For example, if soils become compacted or water sources have dried up, then the plant species that grew at the site might no longer be able to grow. Different plant species may take their place, and among them, a different suite of animal species may find habitat. Sometimes a whole new community may arise. For instance, consider the picture below showing deforestation in the Amazon that has reduced rainfall there. Unprecedented fires have burned tropical rainforests, converting some of them to scrub grassland. In the past, people didn't realize how permanent such changes could be because we tended to view natural systems as static and predictable. Today, ecologists recognize that systems are highly dynamic and can sometimes undergo rapid, extreme, and really long-lasting changes. There's two more terms I'd like to talk about to wrap up this video. The first are keystone species. Keystone species are species that are not very abundant but have large effects on an ecological community. And a second term are indicator species. These are species that demonstrate particular characteristics of an ecosystem. I'd like to first talk about keystone species. Here you see otters, who are a great example of keystone species in certain marine environments. Otters eat sea urchins, and those sea urchins eat kelp. So with the presence of otters, otters can drive down the sea urchin population. With limited numbers of sea urchins, kelp are able to grow. If you remove the otter from the ecosystem, there's nothing to eat the sea urchins. They proliferate, they eat all the kelp. The kelp becomes what's called overgrazed. The reason we call this a keystone species is from the idea of architecture, where a single keystone will help an arch stay intact. The removal of that keystone will cause the arch to collapse. In much the same way, the removal of the otter causes this ecosystem to collapse when the kelp disappears due to overgrazing from the sea urchins. Another example we have are sea stars. Here we see some actual lab data gathered in 1974, and sea stars are predators in their marine environments. And you notice that here on this graph, we're graphing years on the x-axis and species present on the y. In the presence of Pisaster, which is a particular species of sea star, there is a preserved, consistent diversity of species, a large number of species. However, with the removal of those sea stars, the species count plummets. Again, sea stars, due to their interactions with other species in the environment, critical keystone species. One final keystone species we have are the wolves of Yellowstone National Park. Wolves used to be common in Yellowstone National Park, but with the arrival of settlers and tourists, populations dwindled and were almost non-existent. In the 1980s and 1990s, wolves were reintroduced in a somewhat controversial study. However, ecologists were arguing that gray wolves were in fact a keystone species to this environment. And it turns out wolves in Yellowstone keep the ecosystem stable by controlling elk populations, which in turn prevents overgrazing of seedlings and willows along the riverbanks. Without the seedlings, the riverbanks would erode and destroy habitats for beavers and songbirds. There's no other species that fit the role of wolves in Yellowstone, and once they were introduced, the ecosystem regained biodiversity. Another classic example of a keystone species, and one here that maybe has a bit of a negative perception in the public eye, but in fact a very critical role in the ecosystem. The final bit I have here are indicator species, and shown below are two different indicator species. On the left is a larval mayfly living in streams that can indicate water that's uncontaminated by pollutants. On the right is a woodpecker that indicates healthy old-growth forests of longleaf pine. These are common in the southeastern United States. So the presence of these species can give you a bit of an insight into the health of an ecosystem. Here we're seeing some species that indicate water pollution. Again, the presence of that mayfly tells us that pollution is quite low. If instead you look in a stream and you find freshwater shrimp or worms, these tubiflex worms, that gives you indicators that there's actually quite a bit of pollution in that ecosystem. And clearly no life at all would indicate quite high levels of pollution. And the final indicator I have is lichen. Remember we mentioned lichen at the beginning of this video in talking about primary succession, where lichen species are oftentimes the first to colonize. They're these pioneer species in primary succession. Lichens, again, are a combination or a symbiosis of two separate organisms, a fungus and an algae that grow together in a symbiotic relationship where that fungus provides mineral nutrients and a place for the algae to grow, and the algae, through photosynthesis, produces sugars that the fungus can consume. Lichens are oftentimes used as bioindicators because their sensitivity to air pollution. Lichens, they don't have roots. They're, again, just a symbiosis between two single-celled organisms, so they can only get nutrients directly from the atmosphere. They're especially sensitive to excess nitrogen pollution in the air. If scientists start to see a decline in lichen species that are particularly sensitive to nitrogen, along with an increase in species that can tolerate nitrogen, they know that air quality is decreased. Another great example of a indicator species. So having watched this video, I hope that you're able to do these 4 tasks: describe terrestrial ecosystems experience succession, describe whether succession occurs in aquatic ecosystems, identify how succession impacts richness, biomass, and productivity, and explain the importance of keystone species and indicator species. Thanks for watching.